The rain tapped against the window as Daniel sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, clutching a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. The phone rang, shattering the silence, and his chest tightened. He let it ring once, twice, then answered. His sister Emily said, "Daniel, you need to hear this." Her voice trembled, holding something heavier than fear. Daniel whispered, "What happened?" Silence pressed back, the kind that makes your pulse race. Emily finally said, "They've chosen me over you again, but this time it's worse." Daniel stared at the wall, his knuckles whitening, and muttered, "Of course they did." He could almost hear the family dinner clinking without him, the betrayal seeping through each pause. Emily added, "It's not just about me. Dad left something in writing, and you're not even mentioned." Daniel felt his heart fracture in slow motion. Betrayal was no longer suspicion. It was fact. Daniel paced the narrow room, the words replaying like a broken record. He muttered, "Not even mentioned." He had always been the shadow, the afterthought. But this was a deliberate erasure. Memories of birthdays where his name was forgotten, holidays where his chair sat empty, came rushing back. The betrayal now had form and weight. He whispered to himself, "I was never theirs to keep." His chest burned as if rejection were fire eating through his ribs. Daniel had long tried to make peace with scraps of affection, yet scraps could no longer disguise truth. The silence after the call wasn't calm, but suffocating. He felt like the world outside kept moving while his had frozen in place. He remembered Emily's tone, heavy with guilt yet desperate to shield him. She had always been caught between loyalty to him and fear of angering the rest. Daniel muttered, "You shouldn't carry this for me." He pictured her hunched in her own apartment, carrying weight meant for his shoulders. He wished he could comfort her, but the injustice clawed too deep. He pressed his palm against the cool glass, feeling the rain's rhythm mirror his heartbeat. His voice cracked as he whispered, "I'm invisible, even in their memories." The rain outside seemed to echo his grief, its relentless fall drowning out hope. The clock ticked, each second dragging him deeper into emptiness. He thought of his father's absence, the man who left more scars than memories. "Not even in writing," Daniel whispered. The words stung, sharper than rejection, proof of his father's chosen silence. He sank into the chair, gripping the table edge like it could anchor him. His breaths grew ragged, as if every inhale carried years of unspoken hurt. Betrayal had finally found its form in ink, on a paper he hadn't even seen. He shook his head, muttering, "He erased me long before tonight." The apartment hummed with loneliness, shadows flickering like ghosts of his childhood. Daniel leaned back, closing his eyes, replaying every sacrifice he'd made for their approval. He had stayed quiet, swallowed pain, even defended them when others pointed out favoritism. Now the truth glared. They had never seen him. His lips curled bitterly. "I was just convenient when they needed silence," he whispered. His chest tightened, but in the hollow ache there was something new, something sharp. Rage, cold and steady, slithered beneath his grief. He opened his eyes, staring at the rain-washed night. The storm outside no longer felt distant. It was inside him, ready to break. Morning light leaked through the blinds as Daniel watched dust drift like lost thoughts. His phone buzzed, then stopped, as if even bad news was tired. "Noah," said, "I'm downstairs." Daniel opened the door and stepped aside, feeling smaller than his doorway. Noah set a paper bag on the table and said, "Eat first, talk after." Daniel said, "He wrote me out." The words felt foreign, like a confession stolen from someone else. Noah's brow pinched, then softened. He said, "You were never a footnote to me." Daniel looked away. He said, "They train me to be grateful for crumbs." Noah said, "Crumbs are what you throw away, not what you live on." The lines sat between them like a verdict. Daniel nodded, throat tight. He said, "I don't know how to be without wanting them." Noah said, "Start by wanting you." Daniel pulled a shoebox from the closet, and set it on the floor like a fragile animal. Old photos grinned up at him with crooked teeth. Emily said, "Remember this?" Her text arrived with a picture of two kids, one clinging, one shining. Daniel said, "I remember the sweater that never fit." The memory opened like a trap door. He pictured winter mornings where his breath fogged and praise drifted past him. He said, "I learned to be quiet to be allowed." Emily replied, "You learned to survive." He ran a thumb over a photo's bent corner and felt the paper's tired edge. He said, "Maybe surviving was the smallest dream." The room answered with a hush that sounded like agreement. The hallway of his mother's condo smelled like lemon cleaner and withheld questions. She opened the door with a smile that didn't quite learn how to stay. "Mother said, you should have called first." Daniel said, "I did." She glanced at the mantel and fussed with a frame. "Mother said, your father kept meticulous records." Daniel felt the word meticulous scrape. He said, "Except for people." She flinched and smoothed invisible dust. "Mother said, he had reasons." Daniel said, "I had reasons to be his son." The sentence landed and rattled. She whispered, "Let's not make a scene." Daniel said, "There's already a scene. I'm in it." Silence drifted in, dressed like politeness, heavy as stone. Back home, Daniel set a blank page on the table like a dare. The pen waited, quiet and sharp. Noah called, "You okay?" Daniel said, "Define okay." "Noah," said breathing, "counts." Daniel exhaled and let his shoulders fall. He said, "If I write it down, it becomes real." Noah said, "It already is." Daniel put the pen to paper and wrote his name, as if trying it on for size. He said, "I keep wanting to ask for permission." Noah said, "Permission from who?" Daniel paused, then said, "From all the rooms I was told not to enter." The silence that followed felt gentler. The page was still blank everywhere that mattered, and somehow that looked like sky. Evening drew lines across the floor, each one a boundary he had never set. Emily said, "They want us for dinner." Daniel tasted metal and memory. He said, "Do they want me or my silence?" Emily's breath caught like a hinge. She said, "Maybe both." Daniel walked to the window and watched the street's slow pulse. He said, "I'll come, but I won't bring the old version of me." The thought scared him and steadied him. Noah texted, "Proud of you." "I'll be nearby." Daniel said, "I need to hear myself in that room." The promise felt new and risky. He reached for his coat and felt the weight shift from apology to choice. The dining room hummed with the weight of too many unspoken words. Daniel sat at the far end, his eyes fixed on the silverware instead of faces. Emily whispered, "Stay calm." He said, "Calm is for people who belong." Their mother glanced over, her smile rehearsed, her hands twitching near the wine glass. She said, "We should focus on family." Daniel replied, "Whose family?" The laugh that followed wasn't his, but his brother Mark's, sharp and dismissive. Mark said, "You always dramatize." Daniel's jaw tightened. He said, "Maybe you always minimize." Silence stretched thin, waiting for someone to cut it. Their father's empty chair at the table burned louder than voices. Daniel muttered, "Even his absence chooses sides." Mark poured wine with a flourish as if performance excused cruelty. He said, "Dad's estate was complicated." Daniel answered, "Not complicated, convenient." Mark's grin flickered. He said, "You think everything is against you." Daniel leaned forward. He said, "It usually is when you're invisible." Emily's eyes darted between them, her lips tight with worry. Their mother whispered, "Please, not tonight." Daniel said, "Tonight's perfect. It's when truth is seated." Mark set the bottle down too hard, liquid spilling like accusation. He said, "You'll never be satisfied." Daniel's voice dropped. He said, "Not with scraps that were mine to begin with." Later in the kitchen, Emily pressed her palms against the counter. She said, "You're letting him bait you." Daniel stood by the sink, staring at the faucet's slow drip. He said, "He's rewriting my existence." Emily said, "He's scared." Daniel turned, eyes sharp. He said, "Of losing power." Emily's lips quivered. She said, "Of losing control." Daniel muttered, "Control built on silence isn't worth keeping." He leaned against the counter, shoulders shaking with restrained rage. Emily touched his arm, voice softer. She said, "You're not alone in this." Daniel whispered, "Sometimes I think loneliness is the only thing they left me." Daniel stepped outside for air, the night colder than memory. Noah found him leaning against the porch railing. Noah said, "You look like the sky swallowed you." Daniel exhaled, breath visible. He said, "Inside feels worse." Noah placed a hand on the railing beside him. He said, "Mark thrives on shadows. Don't give him yours." Daniel whispered, "He has everything else." Noah's tone sharpened. He said, "Not you." Daniel's lips pressed into a grim line. He said, "I don't know if I'm enough." Noah shook his head. He said, "That's their lie, not your truth." The words lodged where despair had settled. Back inside, Mother gathered plates with trembling hands. She said, "We must keep peace." Daniel stopped her. He said, "Peace without truth isn't peace, it's denial." Mark sneered, leaning in the doorway. He said, "Truth is perspective." Daniel's tone hardened. He said, "Truth is absence where a father should be." Emily gasped, clutching her necklace. Mark's jaw flexed, his mask cracking. He said, "You don't understand what it takes to carry this family." Daniel shot back, "No, I understand what it takes to be erased by it." Plates rattled in Mother's hands, the sound louder than words. Silence weighed heavier than air. The doorbell rang like a verdict, and the house held its breath. Emily said, "Please listen before you react." Daniel opened the door and found a stranger who looked familiar. The woman said, "My name is Lena." Mark stepped into the hall and scoffed. Mark said, "Fans now?" Lena's gaze did not flinch. Lena said, "I'm here because of your father." Mother's hand found the wall like it had learned to lean. Mother said, "Who sent you?" Lena held a folder to her chest as if it were armor. Lena said, "He did years ago." Daniel felt the floor move under his ribs. Daniel said, "What are you to him?" Lena answered softly, "His daughter." The word opened the room like a crack that would not stop. They gathered in the living room like pieces from different sets. Lena placed the folder on the coffee table and waited for air to move. Mark said, "Forgery is cheap." Emily winced and shook her head. Emily said, "Let her speak." Mother lifted a frame, then set it down as if it burned. Mother said, "Your father made mistakes." Daniel stared at the folder as though it carried a heartbeat. Daniel said, "What is in there?" Lena opened it and slid out letters bearing a known script. Lena said, "He supported me in secret." Mark laughed, brittle and thin. Mark said, "He wouldn't hide that." Lena's voice steadied. Lena said, "He hid me so you didn't have to see him." On the back patio, the air felt colder than the month promised. Lena stood near the railing and kept her eyes on a line of roofs. Lena said, "I didn't come to take anything." Daniel kept a careful distance that felt dishonest. Daniel said, "You already took the story." Lena nodded as if the truth asked for a chair. Lena said, "I wanted the man, not the money." Wind lifted the edges of a letter still in her hand. Daniel said, "He wrote to you, and not to me." Lena answered, "He wrote to both of us, just differently." The fence hummed with a passing car. Daniel said, "I don't know what to feel." Lena said, "Me either, but I'm done feeling alone." The argument returned inside like weather that refused to pass. Mark said, "This is a ploy." Emily's voice cut cleaner than anger. Emily said, "It's a mirror." Mother sat down slowly and folded her hands as if sheltering a small bird. Mother said, I knew parts, not all. Daniel felt something icy and old touch his throat. Daniel said, you knew enough to leave me guessing. Lena rested the letters on her lap and breathed like a swimmer at a wall. Lena said, he asked me to meet you one day. Mark snapped, not happening. Daniel stood. Daniel said, it is happening now. The ceiling light hummed, and no one moved. Later, the house emptied its noise, but kept its echoes. Daniel stood in the hallway and felt the letters following like shadows. Noah texted, do you need me there? Daniel typed and erased, then let the phone cool. Daniel said, I keep hearing him not saying my name. Emily stepped beside him and watched the dark window hold their shapes. Emily said, I don't want to lose you to this. He closed his eyes and saw two children holding opposite corners of a photo. Daniel said, I need truth more than comfort. Emily nodded like courage had a cost. Emily said, then pay it, and I'll help count. The floor creaked and settled, the way old stories do. The storm inside the house grew heavier than the rain outside. Mark stood at the head of the table, waving papers like a banner. Mark said, Father left everything under my care. Daniel's chest cracked with disbelief. Daniel said, you forged belonging into ownership. Emily gasped, her voice sharp. Emily said, you can't decide alone. Mark sneered. Mark said, someone had to. Mother sat frozen, her hands twisted into her lap. Mother whispered, it wasn't meant to be this way. Daniel's voice dropped to steel. Daniel said, you turned family into property. Mark laughed without warmth. Mark said, it already was. Mark pushed the folder across the polished wood, the sound like a blade. Daniel opened it, scanning words that carved him out of his own bloodline. Daniel said, he signed me away. Emily reached for his arm but stopped short. Emily whispered, this can't be final. Mark leaned back, triumphant. Mark said, it's binding. Daniel slammed the folder shut, breath heavy. Daniel said, you wear betrayal like a crown. Mark smirked. Mark said, it suits me. Mother turned her face to the side, shame pooling in her silence. Daniel whispered, you've stolen what was mine before it was written. The hallway echoed with footsteps as Daniel stormed out, papers shaking in his hand. Lena followed, her voice unsteady. Lena said, he can't erase you. Daniel stopped, his shoulders trembling. Daniel said, he already did. Lena held her letters closer. Lena said, he gave me shadows too. Daniel turned, eyes sharp with hurt. Daniel said, but you had his words. I had silence. Lena swallowed and whispered, silence can scream if you let it. Daniel's hand shook as he dropped the folder to the floor. He said, all I hear is nothing, and it's louder than truth. In the kitchen, Noah stood by the counter, eyes scanning Daniel's face. Noah said, tell me it's not true. Daniel let the words stick to his tongue before falling. Daniel said, it's all his. Noah stepped forward, voice sharp. Noah said, that doesn't mean it's all over. Daniel laughed bitterly, rubbing his temples. Daniel said, inheritance isn't just money, it's memory. Noah placed a steady hand on his shoulder. Noah said, then rewrite what you inherit. Daniel's chest heaved with anger and grief. One, he said, what if I only know how to inherit silence? Noah whispered, then break it. Back in the living room, Mark toasted with an empty glass, a victor without grace. Mark said, it's settled. Daniel stepped into the doorway, rage controlled but alive. Daniel said, no, it's only beginning. Emily's eyes glistened with fear and hope. Emily whispered, don't let him win this way. Mother's voice trembled as she said, please, not another fracture. Daniel's reply was steady steel. Daniel said, fractures heal. Silence doesn't. Mark lowered his glass, smirk fading. Daniel walked forward, picking up the folder, his voice carrying weight. Daniel said, "If this is betrayal, then let it be witnessed." The living room felt tight, like the walls leaned in to hear. Daniel set the folder down and steadied his voice. Daniel said, "We read everything now." Mark scoffed and crossed his arms. Mark said, "You want a show?" Emily stepped closer, eyes fierce with worry. Emily said, "We want truth." Mother rubbed her wrist and stared at the rug. Mother said, "Please be kind." Daniel unfolded a letter that smelled like dust and years. Daniel said, "He wrote to Lena, not to me." Lena breathed in and held his gaze. Lena said, "He asked me to find you." The room waited for someone to blink first, and no one did. Daniel read a paragraph that circled love without landing. Daniel said, "He hid one child and starved another." Mother flinched and shook her head. "Mother?" said he, struggled with shame. Daniel felt the word sour as it left the air. Daniel said, "Shame is not a will." Emily touched his shoulder, steady but sad. Emily said, "We were taught to swallow." Mark paced as if movement built authority. Mark said, "He trusted me to decide." Lena folded the letters like they were a flag. Lena said, "He trusted secrecy, not wisdom." Daniel closed his eyes and listened to the house creak like an old confession. They moved to the study, where the air held old varnish and old rules. Mark closed the door with a soft click that felt like a dare. Mark said, "You think I'm the villain." Daniel stood by the shelf and traced dust. Daniel said, "I think you liked the costume." Mark's jaw flexed. Mark said, "I kept this family together." Daniel let the silence measure that claim. Daniel said, "You kept me outside to make it look neat." Mark frowned, tired at the edges. Mark said, "I was scared of losing my place." Daniel nodded once like a verdict. Daniel said, "You lost me instead." Back in the dining room, Daniel laid the letters in a row like tracks. Daniel said, "Here is the map of our damage." Emily straightened, ready to walk it with him. Emily said, "We can fix what we name." Mother pressed her palm to her chest. Mother said, "I failed to stop him." Lena's voice found a calm center. Lena said, "We can end the hiding tonight." Mark stared at the window where rain stitched the dark. Mark said, "And who am I without the role?" Daniel lifted his chin and let the fear pass. Daniel said, "A brother, if you choose it. Nothing, if you don't." Daniel's voice steadied into something new. Daniel said, "I won't chase what refuses to see me." Emily nodded like a door gently closing. Emily said, "Then we build another room." Mother's eyes filled but did not break. Mother said, "I want to learn how." Mark's shoulders lowered, pride shrinking to size. Mark said, "I can return what I took to hold." Lena gathered the letters and held them open. Lena said, "Let this be record, not weapon." Daniel felt the storm ease in his ribs. Daniel said, "Truth stands." "Now we do." The family sat scattered across the room, the storm finally quiet outside. Daniel said, "What remains is choice, not inheritance." Emily lifted her chin, eyes shining. Emily said, "I choose you as my brother, always." Mark shifted, guilt lining his voice. Mark said, "I can't undo years, but I can step aside." Mother reached for his hand but touched only air. Mother whispered, "Forgive me for silence." Lena held the stack of letters close, her voice steady. Lena said, "We carry him but not his mistakes." Daniel closed his eyes, breathing in the fragile calm. Daniel said, "Then we carry each other forward." The kitchen smelled of coffee and truce. Daniel poured into chipped mugs, the steam curling like new breath. Daniel said, "I can't erase scars, but I can stop them from writing me." Emily smiled faintly, wrapping her hands around the cup. Emily said, "That's strength, not surrender." Mark stayed quiet, his reflection quivering in the dark liquid. Mark said, "I need to learn how to stand without standing on you." Daniel nodded once, slow and sure. Daniel said, That's the only way I'll stand with you. Mother sipped carefully, tears cutting her smile. Mother whispered, "This tastes like hope." Later, Daniel stepped outside into a sky cleared of clouds. Lena followed, her steps hesitant but honest. Lena said, "We didn't get to choose him, but we can choose each other." Daniel studied her face, finding pieces of himself reflected. Daniel said, "Blood betrayed me. But maybe blood can heal too." Lena smiled softly, the kind that survives storms. Lena said, "Then let's build something new." Daniel breathed deeply, letting the cold air fill empty spaces. Daniel said, "For the first time, I believe that's possible." The silence between them carried less weight, as though the sky itself had lifted. Emily sat beside Daniel on the worn sofa, her voice low but clear. Emily said, "I used to envy you for your silence." Daniel frowned. Daniel said, "Silence was my prison." Emily took his hand, squeezing hard. Emily said, "It was also your strength. You endured what broke me." Daniel shook his head. Daniel said, "Endurance isn't living." Emily's eyes brimmed but didn't fall. Emily said, "But now you're speaking, and I'm proud." Daniel's lips curved slightly, the storm finally loosening its grip. Daniel said, "Then maybe the silence was waiting for this moment." By afternoon, the house stood quieter than it had in years. Daniel packed the letters into a small box, not as burden, but as proof. Noah appeared at the doorway, his smile steady. Noah said, "You look lighter." Daniel closed the box and straightened. Daniel said, "I finally put weight down." Noah nodded. Noah said, "And picked yourself up?" Daniel walked to the window, watching sunlight stretch across the street. Daniel said, "Forgiveness isn't for them. It's for me." Noah placed a hand on his shoulder. Noah said, "Then you've won." Daniel breathed in, his chest no longer breaking but whole.